Hello. So I am not going to make this one too long because it's the early hours of the morning and I have an early train to catch, relatively early by my standards. And I have other things to do, so I don't want to be too tired. But this week marks the Tricentenary of the date which is generally considered to be the starting point of Britain's first Prime Minister. Now, unlike other offices around the world, such as American and French presidencies, this is an office that came about more by accident than by convention or by being established formally. Um, so Robert Walpole was our first prime minister, as is generally considered today. Although there were powerful politicians and ministers before Walpole, such as Stanhope and Sunderland. And these were lords. In Britain, one thing to remember for international viewers is that often you'll hear a place name and it's actually a person's name. Well, that is because it's their title. So Lord Sunderland, it's not talking about the city that I'm in. I doubt that Lord Sunderland ever saw Sunderland, but that was, especially in the past with Britain's peerage system, it was very common to talk about politicians by their peerage title. So Sunderland, Derby, Liverpool, and so on. Now, Walpole was a very shrewd political operator, and the reason he got to high office, or at least the reason he enjoyed high office for so long, was his closeness to King George I and later King George II. Um, and his tenure of office is a very long time, 22 years, or almost 23 years, from 1721 to 1743. That dwarfs any other premiership in longevity. Um, and in those early years, politics was very corrupt. There was certainly nothing like democracy that we see today. The vast majority of men didn't have suffrage, let alone women. So, it was a long process. If we go back in this country to Magna Carta, that was the foundation. It's generally seen as the foundation of British democracy. That was barons. These were powerful nobles, demanding their rights. It certainly wasn't about the common man. Nevertheless, it is the foundation of holding power to account in this country. But, we're going back 800 years, over 800 years. Then there was Simon de Montfort's Parliament. Um, and then there was the English Bill of Rights. And over time, the British Constitution gradually evolved, but it wasn't a single written document as you have with the American Constitution. In fact, it isn't even a written constitution, it's more complex than that. Um, so, what we saw was this gradual evolution of the Westminster system over time. And with the Glorious Revolution in 1688, the divine right of kings and monarchs to have absolute power gradually eroded. So an interesting thing, actually, Americans often think of tyrannical King George III, but actually by his reign, the absolute power of the monarch had diminished, at least in Great Britain. Um, Parliament had become more powerful, and that's why today the Queen is the constitutional monarch. She doesn't have absolute power. It's still a very important role. She's still head of state, but it's very important to understand the evolution of this. That's why British cartoons can freely mock the royal family. That's why we can criticize the Queen without repercussion. It's not really done because she's widely respected, but it can be. We don't have les majestes in this country, and it's a very good thing too. But anyway, I detract. So over the last 300 years, we've had 55 individuals have occupied the office of Prime Minister. But like I say, this was a role that kind of came about by accident. It was never formally set up. In fact, it was a derogatory term in the beginning. You are the Prime Minister, kind of seen as the King's stooge, so to speak, because Walpole was a very shrewd character, but he was also quite corrupt, as were most politicians of the time. But he knew how to operate. He knew how to get the King's favour. And although the king constitutionally had less power, nevertheless, it was politically useful for Walpole to be close to him because some of those early Georges did tend to interfere in politics. although they weren't really allowed to, they did, especially the Prince Regent George IV. He later became George IV. Um, so also Queen Victoria actually had an early constitutional situation. It wasn't quite a full-blown crisis, but it was quite serious, and it was called the bedchamber crisis when she basically angered the Tories, the Conservative Party, by favouring her ladies in waiting to be the wives of Whig politicians. So that was seen as favouritism. And there is strict convention in this country that the monarch and the royal family in general cannot pick political sides. Um, I'm not going to give a long, long history of each and every prime minister, but over time, particularly into the 20th century, the role was becoming more formalized. Actually, technically, the title is First Lord of the Treasury. And going back in British constitutional history, you've always had sort of leading ministers. For example, in the reign of Henry VIII, they were usually clergy figures like Cardinal Wolsey. Um, and often there were times where regents kind of were the real power in the country when there was a young monarch, such as the reign of King Edward VI. I believe it was Thomas Seymour at that time, but I could be wrong about that. So these were powerful figures, usually peers who either acted as regents or served as particularly influential people in the monarch's ear. Um, by the 20th century, that is actually, I believe it was under Sir Henry Campbell-Bannerman, a Liberal Prime Minister, when the term Prime Minister was first formalised as late as 1905. Um, so that's interesting. By the 20th century, you start getting more presidential styles of prime minister, particularly with Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair. Their whole style was quite presidential, insofar as election campaigns, insofar as with general elections, there was a lot of focus on the leader. In Britain, we don't actually vote for the prime minister; we vote for the party. But realistically, people really do look at the party leader because the two big parties, Labour and Conservatives, um, whichever one of them gets the most votes in a general election, their leader will be prime minister. Um, they're the two big parties, but the last time, for example, a Liberal was prime minister, you have to go back to David Lloyd George 100 years ago. Nick Clegg came close. I mean, he was deputy prime minister under David Cameron, and Clegg was actually the most powerful Liberal since David Lloyd George. So that was an interesting constitutional, or rather, political turn of events. But of course, as the minor party, Clegg suffered, and they were punished for all the excesses of the Tories, as seen by the left at least in that era. Um, of the seven prime ministers in my lifetime, Margaret Thatcher, John Major, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, Theresa May, and Boris Johnson, of those seven figures, it's actually Tony Blair, I would say, was most influential on me. Now, people a little bit older than me, especially of Generation X, would very much like Margaret Thatcher. And there's no question that there's overlap between the two. Um, Major's sort of seen as the grey years, although he was Prime Minister for almost 7 years. It was quite a long time. But Blair and Thatcher were the two political giants of my lifetime. And for me, I've always found Tony Blair fascinating. I mean, Margaret Thatcher, of course, is very interesting because she was the first woman prime minister and she had a very turbulent time in office. But for me, I'm a millennial. Tony Blair was a prime minister that really shaped British millennials, I would argue. Um, so, he's kind of today, I do think, and I don't want to make a lengthy video just about Tony Blair, that's for another video, but I do feel that his achievements are largely overshadowed by his controversies, particularly Iraq. Iraq will always be the shadow over Tony Blair. Also, certain things about the Big Brother state that started coming in the Blair years. But I think that's unfortunate because I think I, with Tony Blair, I do have some respect for him. I'm going to say it. As a centrist, Tony Blair, I believe, really did um, push a third way agenda. And if you are of a centrist persuasion, you cannot help but be impressed and somewhat respectful of Tony Blair because what he done was he contrary to this hard left claim, he was not a closet Tory. I think that's nonsense. What he done was realised that the only way Labour could win was by reaching out, really reaching out. And one could argue he went too far. I think New Labour probably got far too cosy with the Murdoch press. But I do think it's unfortunate that all you have to do is see a video or a clip of Tony Blair, and you get the usual people coming in as a war criminal, liar, etc. Um, and there's very, very little critical thinking when it comes to Blair's premiership. And I think that's very unfortunate because this was a man who won three general elections, a Democratic mandate, and he shaped a generation. So I think we should be a little bit more open minded in looking at his legacy and his era. Among the many positive things was the longest period of sustained growth for a long time, the introduction of the minimum wage. I mean, there are things in his premiership that really deserve more credit. In Kosovo, Tony Blair is widely hailed. There's literally little boys in Kosovo whose parents changed their name to Tony Blair or derivatives of that because they were so grateful for Western intervention in that conflict, along with Bill Clinton. Um, so it's unfortunate that in Britain people are so they just jump onto this bandwagon of hating Tony Blair, and I wonder how many of them really do, and how many of them are jumping on the bandwagon. I just think we need to be a bit more balanced in our assessment of this prime minister. Um, Churchill, of course, is the great towering figure, and I think he probably is the greatest prime minister. Churchill was probably not an outstanding domestic prime minister. I think a lot of that credit should go to Clement Attlee and that Labour government of 1945. Nevertheless, there's no getting away from the fact that Churchill was there in our darkest hour. I don't think you can ever underestimate that. So I've no problem with Churchill being named the greatest prime minister. Other figures that should definitely be in that conversation: David Lloyd George, William Ewart Gladstone, Clement Attlee, I would say. Thatcher and Blair are very polarizing figures. I would put them in the top 10, probably not the top five. Um, people who idolize Thatcher to such an extent forget how despised her policies were in regions like the one that I'm in. They overlook that. Just as hard left vilify her, the right and conservatives excessively eulogize her and forget that, overlook some of the pain that her policies caused. Um, then you get a lot of prime ministers who are not outstanding. They're not absolutely towering figures, but they probably deserve a little bit more credit. Figures like Harold Macmillan and Harold Wilson and Charles Grey, Earl Grey. It was under his tenure, in fact, that the Great Reform Act came in and the abolition of the slave trade. So, it's a fascinating subject. I might one day make a book on the prime ministers, all of them. There's been books on post-war prime ministers, but there's not actually many contemporary books on those early prime ministers. Figures like Henry Pelham and the Duke of Newcastle were in power for a long time, but we don't know a great deal about them, or at least not today. They're not remembered today. Lord Liverpool was prime minister for 14 years. Um, Only Sir Robert Walpole and William Pitt the Younger were in office longer. So, figures like that probably deserve a lot more attention and academic interest, and I would argue cultural interest. Okay, I'll round it up. That is, this week, 300 years of the British Premiership. Number 10, probably the most famous door in the world. Um, and by office, the British Prime Minister is the most powerful person in this country. And given that Britain is a great state, therefore, by definition, one of the most powerful people in the world, certainly in the top 20 at least. Um, so, very interesting subject. Who's your favourite Prime Minister and why? Let me know your thoughts.